One scientist in 10,000 wins a Nobel Prize. One scientist in 100,000 becomes a household name. This series is about the painstaking, often unrecognized research that goes on day after day to help us all. This kind of rich, rolling greenness we take pretty much for granted in a country that has no typhoons, precious few blizzards, no real earthquakes, no volcanoes, no termites, no locusts. And if there is an infestation of green fly or codling moth or cabbage white butterflies, we can hit them with sophisticated insecticides and yet still afford to buy, albeit with the occasional grumble, the fat and beautiful vegetables that fill our greengrocers' shops. But just suppose that this field of homegrown maize was attacked by a pest that could actually eat the whole lot down to the ground in 2 days. And suppose that the farmer had no insecticides, and suppose that he had no lorries and no nearby motorway to enable him to get any, and suppose that he had no money to pay for any. Well, it's that sort of situation that this film is about. And it's about the scientist's quest to find the beginnings of a solution in a country 6,000 miles away. This is Kenya, East Africa. It's a beautiful country, but it's far from being a rich one. With very little industry, it depends for survival on agriculture, and a large proportion of its population are small farmers who cultivate a few acres each to feed their own families and, if they're lucky, have a little produce left over that they can sell. Paul Mbulamuviwa farms the steep hillside at Kaunda in the Central Highlands. So, about how long have you been farming here?
For about 4 years. But it has been used by my father for about 8 to 10 years. Yes.
So you've inherited the land from your father?
Yes, I inherited it.
Are you farming it in the same way that he did, or are you trying to change things a little?
I am trying to change it a little, to modernize the way of farming.
This year, the rains came at just the right time for his maize crop, and it looked as if he might have some left over to sell. But, like the other farmers round about, he was robbed by a pest that he couldn't afford to fight. This is the resting form, the pupa of the insect that has cost Paul Muviwa more than half his crop. But it's the caterpillar, the destructive larval stage in its life cycle, that has done the damage. You've had a lot of trouble with your maize, haven't you?
Yes, a lot of trouble due to these pests. The pests are not in my place only. They are widespread in this place. But those who have a lot of money, they proceeded, they jump over the pests because they spread the pesticides. But to those who have no money, they just do it and pray God.
In Swahili, the pest is called viwavi jeshi, the armyworm. But the Africans have another name for it too. They call it the mystery worm because it seems to come from and go to nowhere. To the scientists who are trying to destroy it, it's Spodoptera exempta, and it's just one of the farmers' enemies being studied here at the Kenyan Agricultural Research Institute at Maguga, about 20 miles north of the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. One of the visiting scientists is Dr. Gavin Gatehouse, a zoologist from the University College of North Wales at Bangor, and he explained that while it may be called the armyworm, it's not really a worm at all.
It's a lepidopteran, a moth, and the caterpillar, which is called the armyworm, is the stage which does the damage.
Yeah. So what is its life cycle then?
Well, the moth lays its eggs usually on a particular species of grass, and these hatch to produce tiny larvae which are only a few millimeters long, and these then march to over short distances probably to the nearest suitable vegetation. It does feed exclusively on grass species, but of course that includes many of the most important crops. As far as the armyworm is concerned, maize is probably the most important. Sorghum it will attack, wheat where that's grown, and any gramineous crop plant. Yeah. And the larvae establish themselves on the host plant and grow fairly rapidly and remain on the plants for as long as there is food on that plant. However, if the densities are high enough to eat out that particular zone of plants, then the larvae will march. And when you get very high densities of larvae moving off a crop which they've eaten out, they may march over bare ground, over roads and so on, and hence the name armyworm.
After 20 years in East Africa, infestations like this are nothing unusual to the head of Gatehouse's area of research, Dr. Derek Rose.
The characteristic of them is that they're very dense aggregations of the caterpillars on the crops or the grasses, and once they reach nearly full-grown size, they begin to eat very, very rapidly. They can destroy a crop of wheat in a couple of days. One day it can be all there, the next day it can be gone. And then they start marching once the crop is eaten, and you see them moving across roads in very, very large numbers. You can find as many as 1,000 per square metre. This is not unusual. And there are stories of the railway train from Mombasa to Nairobi being held up because armyworm crossing it, the skidding on the rails.
The significance is not in the size of the larva, but in the numbers, as is true with many of these pests. It is the sheer weight of numbers and the amount of vegetation they consume when they're present in high densities, which is the problem.
And elegantly 20th century as its capital Nairobi may be, Kenya can't afford to lose any of its precious crops. Minister of Agriculture, Mr. James Osogo.
It is a big problem and a big threat too to agriculture. As you know, the armyworm moth is spread quite a bit in Eastern Africa. That means in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Sudan, and Somalia, and also Ethiopia. So the production of this insect in these two countries becomes quite a threat in Eastern Africa, and it is a big threat to our crop in Kenya.
But as James Osogo pointed out, the nature of the insect brings other problems too.
First of all, it is a very unpredictable pest in that its life is very short, and then when it becomes pupae, we find it difficult to trace it. But we have difficulties in communication because of the area, the large area in Kenya where this insect comes out.
To repel an invading army, you have to be able to reach it. But this is the main road through a country 3 times the size of England, Scotland and Wales. Away from Kenya's main artery, the roads are even smaller and much worse, although in any case there's precious little motorised transport. These, the small-time farmers, are the people who need the insecticides most when an armyworm invasion starts. But they're also the people it's hardest to get them to.
Our experience has shown that the small farmer is hit harder than the large-scale farmer in that he has got little crop, and when they come in millions, they devour the leaves on his crop. And then the large-scale farmer, large as it is easier to combat using our means, using Land Rovers to spray the insects on the field, whilst it's very difficult on a small farm.
Even if you have the wherewithal to attack the worm, though, its lifestyle makes it hard to find. Starting life as an egg, it isn't until 7 to 10 days after hatching that it's big enough to catch the eye. And soon after that, it lives up to its name as the mystery worm and does a disappearing act.
When the larva is fully grown, it leaves the plant and burrows down into the soil. They then turn round and excavate themselves a neat little chamber, and then pupate. They then change to the next stage, which is the pupa. The pupal stage lasts for something of the order of 10 days, maybe as little as 6 in the really hot areas. And then this splits open and the moth emerges, pushes its way out through the layer of soft particles, the soft dust on the top, and climbs up a grass stem. At this stage, its wings are folded up, not expanded, and it sits there for something of the order of a quarter of an hour while it pumps blood into its wings to expand them, and then the moth is ready to fly.
News comes into the research institute that there's a heavy infestation about 90 miles east of Nairobi. The information is 2 days old, but Gatehouse sets off in the hope of collecting specimens for his research. On the rutted dirt roads, the Land Rover leaves the characteristic smokescreen of the red dust of Africa. Gatehouse drives as fast as is safe, but it still takes 3 hours to reach the field that bore the brunt of the armyworm's attack. And there isn't a caterpillar to be seen. There's no doubt they've been there. What might have been adequate pasture looks like stubble. But Spodoptera exempta hasn't gone away. Hacking at the hard earth with his panga, Gatehouse finds them not quite at rest in those little underground chambers. He collects nearly 100 from a tiny patch of earth to take back to Nairobi. When these hatch out, it'll be to help man rather than rob him. Their first flight may help to reveal the armyworm's secret.
The major problem, of course, with armyworm is that it is a migrant. And the moths fly large distances and therefore move, and the infestations move through the season.
Now, is that an inbuilt characteristic of every single armyworm?
No, not quite, and this is really why I have got involved in this project. The caterpillars are curious in that they come in various forms. And the form in which the caterpillars come depends on the densities of caterpillars in the area in which they happen to be. If the densities are extremely low, the caterpillars are green, they're very sluggish, and they feed at the base of the grasses. So they're extremely inconspicuous. And people don't know them because they're difficult to see, and even when they do see them, they don't recognize them because they're so different from the other form, which you get in the high densities. The caterpillars are quite different. They're black, a sort of velvety black. They are extremely active. They climb up the plants and feed on the foliage, very voraciously indeed. And so they're different. They appear entirely different.
Because the non-aggressive caterpillars are unrecognizable and feeding on remote and uncultivated grasslands, there's no hope of spraying the armyworm out of existence. The best the project can hope for is to develop a strategy to control the outbreaks that devastate the crop-growing areas of East Africa. But providing protection from southern Tanzania to beyond the Red Sea is an almost impossible job. The enemy is a highly mobile one. In November and December, it's in Tanzania. It hits Kenya and Uganda early on in the new year and passes on up the whole of East Africa into Ethiopia and Somalia until it finishes in the Yemen around about September.
Because of the unpredictable movement of the moths, it has not been easy for us to combat it. But if a scientist will be able to establish to us the movement, the migratory movement of the insect, I think it will greatly help us to fight it, knowing very well that it will come out at a certain period of the year and in certain places. I think it will help us greatly, and we will be prepared to fight it. But as it is now, it takes us by surprise because of its nature of movement.
A shortage of resources and an unpredictable pest attacking along an enormous front means that forecasting is all important, because if you know where the swarm of moths is going to arrive, you can have what insecticides and what people are available there to greet them. So there's a network of stations like this one all over East Africa. equipped with traps to sample the migratory moths as they pass through. And then, because the moths are carried by wind and often arrive in a downpour, the Research Institute also has all the impedimenta of a meteorological station. Information comes into this office from all over East Africa about the density of the caterpillars on the ground, the number of moths caught in the traps, about wind strength and directions, about sunshine and rainfall. From these figures, a forecast can be sent ahead of the invading swarm to the areas or the countries that lie in its path. It might be possible then to say where these moths were going to. The unanswered question is, where were they coming from? If that were known, it might be possible to kill them off generations earlier. And it's a solution to that puzzle that Dr. Gatehouse's work aims to help solve.
Now, in the field, you can look at moths using radar, and a radar entomology team from Britain has been doing this. You can use light traps. You can use pheromone traps. They will give you moths, but those moths have no tag on them to say where they've come from. The only way you can actually follow the behavior of an individual moth is to have a look at it in the laboratory. And this is why this technique for flying moths in the laboratory, which we've developed, has hopefully been of use to the project.
Just about everything about the moths that can be measured has been measured. But you can't track a moth over Africa with a stopwatch in your hand. And the great unknown was how long the moths are capable of flying, and whether all moths have the same capacity for flight. To test that, the moths have to be tethered. Now, that's traditionally been done by fixing some kind of an anchorage to the moth's back, and to keep the creature still while that's done, it's been anaesthetized. The anesthetic, though, affects the insect's flying ability, and so undermines the experiment. So Gatehouse fixes the anchorage not to the moth, but to the pupa, and that doesn't need an anesthetic. It's located on a sponge block, but it's actually kept still by its own pupal skin. Gatehouse removes a piece of that skin from the pupa, and then he glues a tiny plastic tube onto the back of the moth within that it will carry for the rest of its life. This pupa wasn't far from its emergence as a moth. It begins to wriggle expectantly while it's still under the microscope. It's quickly placed in a dish of fine sand, and within seconds the skin splits. The squirming moth, its wings not yet inflated, heaves itself into the next phase of its life. There isn't time to provide it with a twig to crawl up. Instead, it's offered a sheet of paper, and it scurries up that to wait for its wings to pump up and dry off, apparently unconcerned by the unnatural appendage on its back. At last it's ready, and held by the mounting tube shows neither damage nor unwillingness to fly. It's as night falls, when instinct tells the moths it's time to take off, that Gatehouse makes his next move to solve this creature's mysterious flight pattern. These, an ingenious mixture of homemade and high engineering, are Gatehouse's flight measurers. Each still resting moth is fixed to the tip of a balance arm made from needle-fine tubing, which is inserted into the tube on its thorax. At the other end of the balance arm, there's a small metal flag. When the moth is at rest, it sits on a cardboard drum, but as soon as it starts to fly up, the flag at the other end of the balance arm drops down and activates a photoelectric cell. That switches on a solenoid, and that in turn draws the cardboard drum away from the moth as the earth would seem to drop away in life, and it's free to fly. So as not to frighten the moth with sudden movement, the action's damped by having the counterweight suspended in thin oil. This moth's had enough. It starts to descend, and that brings the flag back into the photoelectric cell. The solenoid is switched off, and the counterweights gently return the moth's runway to its reaching feet. And the duration of that flight has been noted by a pen chart recorder. 1 pen to each moth. It's switched on by the cell that activates the solenoid and switched off again as the moth lands. This is the nearest anyone has got to having a tethered insect achieve free flight, and from the normality of their behavior, it looks as if the moths don't even know they're not free. It's a neat piece of miniature engineering, and it showed up some very interesting differences in what appear to be identical moths. Differences that really spring from the time when they were in the caterpillar stage, and either thin on the ground, the so-called solitary condition, or very crowded in a thriving gregarious population.
Well, it showed really that the gregarious moths fly much more persistently than the solitary ones. And we're talking now in terms of flights which could be significant in terms of migration, flights lasting hours rather than minutes. Very few of the solitary moths, and this applies particularly to females, fly for durations of more than a few minutes, perhaps up to half an hour or so. Whereas among the gregarious moths, the moths from the gregarious larvae, I should say, something like 30% showed flights, single flights that is, of more than 9 hours duration. And one champion flew for 21 hours, 15 minutes.
With only a moderately helpful breeze, a moth flying for that sort of time could cover 200 to 300 miles. But that still leaves a lot of questions about their origins unanswered.
The reason we came out here originally was to test the hypothesis that most of the armyworm moths that come to Kenya had originated from Tanzania. And we're not so sure now. We still know a lot do come up from Tanzania, and Gavin's work has shown that the populations consist of long flyers and short flyers, and that those which are long flyers are induced to be long flyers by the fact they are concentrated in crowds in the outbreaks. And that those that are in low numbers, what we call the solitary phase caterpillars, produce on the whole moths that don't fly far. Now this is not cut and dry by any means, yet he's still doing more work this year, particularly looking at the outbreaks themselves.
What we're really interested in doing now is to go into the field, collect larvae from actual infestations, where the density is known, and see if we can pick out the characteristics at the larval stage which will tell us to what extent the moths emerging from that infestation are going to fly.
What will that enable you to do that you can't do now?
Well, it'll possibly enable one to use one's resources for control more efficiently, in that if you accept that they are limited, and they nearly always are, then it would obviously make much more sense to put the control effort into hitting populations which were going to result in a lot of movement of the moths, rather than ones, say, in non-critical grassland, which were going to result in lesser movements.
The mystery worm isn't in a hurry to reveal its secrets, and years of investigation have provided only a working hypothesis. The research is painstaking and vital, but because the pest is a problem to the poorer people of poorer countries, it's hard to raise the funds and find the staff for the project. While the Western world worries about the green fly on its roses and hasn't even heard of Spodoptera exempta, the East African smallholder has to compete with it for survival.
It would be very difficult to assess its economic importance as a pest in terms of figures, in terms of money. But if you happen to be a shamba owner, a little farmer with your little plot of maize, which is your year's livelihood, and you happen to be in the path of an infestation, your loss is total. And it is this aspect, really, which is the one which should be kept in mind when thinking of the armyworm as a pest.
The worms have damaged a lot of your maize. What will you do now?
Only to starve. It's only to starve, unless I am left feeding on bananas and a few fruits.